The rain fell relentlessly, large droplets pelting the bustling streets of the city. Margaret, an 82-year-old woman, trudged forward, her frail hands gripping an umbrella that had seen better days. The hem of her coat was damp and heavy, dragging with every step. Her feet, clad in worn shoes, splashed through shallow puddles as she clutched a crumpled note in one hand. The note bore the name and address of a renowned restaurant she had heard of long ago but never imagined she would visit. Tonight, however, was different. She had promised herself she would make it there, no matter the obstacles. Her determination cut through the icy air as she approached the grand building at the heart of the city. When Margaret arrived at the restaurant, its brilliance almost overwhelmed her. The opulent lights spilled onto the wet pavement, and the faint aroma of fine cuisine wafted through the air. She paused at the entrance, taking in the elegant surroundings. The doorway alone was an elaborate display, adorned with gilded carvings and an immaculately polished glass door. Patrons dressed in tailored suits and glamorous dresses breezed past her, their laughter light and carefree. Margaret hesitated, glancing at her reflection in the glass. Her simple, outdated coat and scuffed shoes contrasted sharply with the sophistication around her, but the promise etched in her memory drove her forward. As she stepped inside, a sudden hush seemed to fall over the crowd near the entrance. Conversations dwindled, replaced by curious, and some judgmental, glances. Margaret's entrance was far from grand. The puddles she carried on her shoes created small, muddy prints on the marble floor. She tightened her grip on her umbrella, her wrinkled face remaining calm despite the invisible weight of disapproval pressing against her. Each step deeper into the restaurant felt like walking into a foreign world. The soft clinking of glasses, the muted laughter, and the golden glow of chandeliers above were a stark contrast to her modest reality. The young hostess at the reception desk quickly noticed Margaret and tilted her head with a slight frown. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but edged with skepticism. Margaret smiled faintly, her weathered hand retrieving the crumpled reservation note from her pocket. "I have a reservation," she said softly, sliding the paper across the counter. The hostess hesitated before picking it up, her manicured fingers smoothing it out as she scanned the details. Her lips pursed, her eyes narrowing slightly. Margaret stood silently, her heart steady but her gaze fixed on the polished floor. She had imagined this moment countless times, but the warmth she hoped to feel was absent. The hostess finally looked up, her expression unchanging. "Just a moment," she said, her tone clipped, before disappearing into a side room. Margaret glanced around, catching sight of several pairs of eyes that quickly turned away when met with hers. She straightened her shoulders, determined to see this through. Margaret took in the restaurant's grandeur, a place far beyond anything she had ever experienced. The gilded arches, velvet-lined booths, and towering centerpieces of fresh roses spoke of luxury and exclusivity. Her tired eyes rested on the soft glow of candlelight reflecting off crystal glasses, a quiet elegance filling the air. It was the kind of place she had read about in magazines, a sanctuary for the wealthy and privileged. Yet here she stood, her presence a stark anomaly in the sea of refinement. As the moments passed, the murmurs from the surrounding patrons grew louder. A couple seated nearby exchanged glances, their curiosity barely concealed. Another table, occupied by a group of young professionals, burst into muted laughter, their eyes darting toward Margaret. She tightened her grip on her umbrella, her fingers brushing the tattered fabric of her coat. Despite the uneasy stares, she maintained her composure, her face betraying none of the discomfort swirling in her chest. When the hostess returned, she was accompanied by a man in a sharp suit, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he began, his voice smooth but firm. "There seems to be some confusion. We don't typically accommodate walk-ins without proper notice. Margaret lifted her chin, her voice steady as she repeated her earlier words. I have a reservation. It was confirmed. She extended the note again, her hands trembling slightly. The man took it reluctantly, his sharp eyes scanning the paper before letting out a soft sigh. The manager, Daniel, handed the note back with a strained smile. It appears there was an oversight in the reservation system, he said, his tone dismissive. This is an exclusive establishment, and we must maintain certain standards. His words cut like shards of ice, and Margaret felt her resolve waver. The crowd's whispers grew bolder, emboldened by the apparent rejection. Margaret steadied herself, inhaling deeply before responding. This reservation was made in honor of someone very important. I will wait as long as necessary for you to verify it. Her calm determination seemed to surprise Daniel, though his expression remained stoic. He glanced over her shoulder at the curious onlookers, then waved a hand dismissively. Fine, he muttered, gesturing toward a secluded corner. Wait there while we sort this out. The hostess led Margaret to a small, unremarkable bench near the entrance. She perched on its edge, her back straight despite the heavy stares from passers-by. She kept her eyes forward, the folded reservation note clutched tightly in her hands. Around her, the hum of the restaurant resumed, but the atmosphere remained charged with tension. Margaret sat in the corner, feeling the weight of the restaurant's atmosphere pressing on her. The murmurs of judgmental patrons buzzed around her like an incessant swarm, each whisper a subtle sting. She clutched her worn purse close to her chest, her fingers brushing over the crumpled note as though drawing strength from it. Nearby, a young couple whispered to each other, the woman's laughter tinged with mockery. Margaret caught snippets of their conversation. How did she even get in here? The man chuckled, shaking his head. The hostess returned, flanked by Daniel, the manager. His expression remained impassive, but his tone carried an edge of impatience. Ma'am, he began, I've double-checked, and while this reservation seems legitimate, I'm afraid we have certain standards of dress and decorum here. His eyes flitted briefly over Margaret's coat, his meaning unmistakable. She straightened her back, her voice calm but firm. This reservation was not made lightly. I'm here to honor a promise. Daniel hesitated, his polished exterior cracking under Margaret's steady gaze. He seemed to weigh his options before finally sighing. Fine. We will seat you, but please understand that this is a courtesy, he said, gesturing for her to follow. As Margaret rose, the low hum of voices grew louder. She felt their stares, sharp and intrusive, but she held her head high. Each step she took felt like a victory against the tide of disdain surrounding her. Margaret was led to a small table near the back of the restaurant, tucked away from the central dining area. The location felt deliberate, as though to shield her from the view of more esteemed patrons. The table itself was immaculate, adorned with fine linen and gleaming silverware. Margaret lowered herself into the chair with a quiet dignity, her hands resting on the table as she observed her surroundings. Nearby, a group of well-dressed diners watched her with open curiosity. One woman leaned toward her companion, her voice loud enough for Margaret to hear. I can't believe they're letting someone like her stay, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Margaret's chest tightened, but she refused to let her composure falter. She busied herself with the menu, its elegant script a stark contrast to the simple meals she was accustomed to. The whispers persisted, their sharp edges slicing through the fragile barrier of civility. But Margaret remained resolute, her eyes scanning the menu as though oblivious to the storm brewing around her. She reminded herself of why she had come, of the promise she had carried in her heart for so many years. The noise around her became a distant hum, her focus narrowing to the task at hand, keeping her dignity intact in the face of mounting humiliation. The manager returned to Margaret's table with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Have you decided on your order, ma'am?" he asked, his tone clipped. Margaret placed the menu down gently, her fingers trembling only slightly. "I'll have the chef's special, please," she replied, her voice steady. Daniel's expression faltered for a moment, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face before he composed himself. "Very well," he said, before turning on his heel and striding away. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Margaret could feel the room's attention still on her, a mixture of curiosity, pity, and scorn. She reached into her purse and retrieved a small, folded photo, holding it gently in her hands. It was old, its edges worn, but the image it held was vivid in her mind. A young man in a soldier's uniform smiled back at her, his face filled with gratitude and hope. Margaret traced the outline of his features with her thumb, drawing strength from the memory. Her reverie was interrupted by the arrival of a waiter, who placed a steaming plate before her with mechanical precision. The dish was exquisite, its presentation an artful blend of colors and textures. Margaret thanked him softly, her gratitude sincere despite the coldness of his demeanor. She picked up her fork, the first taste a revelation of flavors she hadn't experienced in years. For a brief moment, the world outside her table faded, and she allowed herself to savor the simple joy of a well-cooked meal. As Margaret continued her meal, the restaurant door swung open, and a man in a tailored suit entered. His presence commanded immediate attention, his confident stride and polished demeanor marked him as someone of significance. Alan Grayson was a well-known figure in the city, the heir to a successful business empire. He scanned the room with sharp eyes, his gaze landing on Margaret's table. His steps faltered for a moment, his brow furrowing in recognition. Without hesitation, he approached, weaving through the maze of tables until he stood before her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice measured but tinged with curiosity. Margaret looked up, her calm demeanor meeting his piercing gaze. "Yes," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. Alan gestured to the chair opposite her. "May I?" he asked. Margaret nodded, and he sat down, his expression thoughtful. "You remind me of someone," he began, his voice softening. "Someone my father once spoke of, a woman who saved his life during the war. May I ask your name?" Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile as she replied, "Margaret." "Margaret Holloway." Alan's eyes widened at her response, and he leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Margaret Holloway," he repeated, the name rolling off his tongue with a sense of familiarity. "That's the name he mentioned. My father always spoke about a nurse who saved him in his darkest hour. He said she was the reason he built this restaurant, to honor her kindness." Margaret's expression softened as memories flooded back. "Your father was a brave man," she said quietly. "He promised me that if I ever needed help, I could come here. I didn't intend to claim that promise, but circumstances changed." Her voice faltered, but Alan's steady gaze urged her to continue. "I kept his letter all these years," Margaret said, pulling the crumpled envelope from her purse. She handed it to Alan, who opened it carefully. His eyes scanned the familiar handwriting, the words confirming what he already suspected. He looked up at Margaret, his voice filled with emotion. "You're the reason this place exists. And you were treated like this?" Alan's hands trembled slightly as he held the letter, its yellowed edges a testament to its age and significance. The handwriting was unmistakably his father's, each word etched with heartfelt gratitude. He read aloud. To Miss Margaret Holloway. Your kindness and courage saved my life when I had lost all hope. Though I cannot repay you fully, I promise that my doors will always be open to you, should you ever need a haven. The restaurant I plan to build will stand as a tribute to people like you, those who embody true compassion. The room, once alive with murmurs and whispers, fell silent. Alan's voice carried through the air, each word landing like a stone in a pond, rippling across the restaurant. Margaret's head remained bowed, her gaze fixed on her hands, which were folded delicately in her lap. Alan placed the letter on the table and looked directly at her, his voice steady but laced with emotion. You saved my father's life, and by extension, mine. This restaurant wouldn't exist without you, and yet you were treated so poorly. His gaze flickered toward the staff, his jaw tightening. That will not stand. The scene shifted in Margaret's mind as Alan's words opened a floodgate of memories. It was a cold, bitter night during the war, the kind that froze hope in its tracks. Margaret, a young nurse stationed at a field hospital, worked tirelessly to save lives amid chaos and despair. Her hands, though steady and skilled, bore the scars of endless nights treating wounded soldiers. One evening, a convoy arrived carrying injured men. Among them was a young officer, barely clinging to life. His face was pale, his body weak from the shrapnel wounds that riddled his torso. Margaret knelt beside him, her gentle touch contrasting the harsh conditions. You'll be all right, she had whispered, though she wasn't certain he would be. Over the following weeks, she tended to him with unwavering dedication. Slowly, the officer, Alan's father, regained his strength. On the day he left the hospital, he grasped Margaret's hand firmly. If I survive this war, he said, I'll dedicate my life to honoring people like you. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Margaret never saw him again, but his words stayed with her, a glimmer of light in the years of darkness that followed. Alan's voice pulled Margaret back to the present. I've heard that story my entire life, he said, his expression thoughtful. But I never imagined I'd meet the woman who made it all possible. Margaret smiled faintly, her eyes misty. Your father's gratitude was enough. I never expected more. Alan leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping the room. This restaurant was built because of you, yet you were made to feel unwelcome. That's unacceptable. He turned sharply toward Daniel, the manager, and Julia, the hostess, who stood frozen nearby, their faces pale. You both owe this woman an apology, Alan said firmly. His tone left no room for argument. What happened here tonight goes against everything this place stands for. Daniel's face reddened as he stepped forward, his polished demeanor cracking. I'm sorry, ma'am, he stammered, his voice barely audible. Julia followed suit, her head bowed in shame. I apologize as well. We should have treated you with respect. The apology hung in the air, a fragile moment of reckoning. The once judgmental patrons now seemed uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as they avoided Margaret's gaze. Alan, however, wasn't finished. This is more than an apology, he said, his voice resonating with authority. It's about remembering why this restaurant exists and who it's meant to honor. He gestured toward Margaret. This woman embodies the values my father cherished: kindness, resilience, and humanity. From this moment forward, she is a permanent guest of honor at this establishment. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by scattered applause. Margaret, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in the atmosphere, shook her head gently. "That's not necessary," she murmured. "It is," Alan insisted, his expression softening. "This is as much your legacy as it was my father's. You deserve to be celebrated, not shunned." His words carried a quiet conviction that silenced any further protests. Alan waved over the waiter who had served Margaret earlier. "Bring out our finest bottle of wine," he instructed. "And prepare a meal fit for a queen." The waiter nodded, his demeanor now transformed with a mix of respect and urgency. As the staff hurried to fulfill Alan's request, the patrons began to shift their attention from Margaret's worn coat to the radiant grace she exuded. Some whispered among themselves, acknowledging the lesson they had just witnessed. Others offered warm smiles, as if silently apologizing for their earlier judgments. Margaret, though still seated at the modest table, now felt like she was at the heart of the room. The weight of years of solitude lifted slightly as she allowed herself to feel the warmth of the moment. Alan, seated across from her, raised his glass. "To Margaret Holloway," he said, his voice steady. "And to the legacy of compassion she inspired." The room joined in the toast, and for the first time that evening, Margaret allowed herself to smile fully. As the toast settled and the atmosphere shifted, Alan stood, his commanding presence drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "Tonight," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "we have witnessed a moment that reminds us of the true purpose of this place. My father envisioned this restaurant not as a sanctuary for the privileged but as a tribute to kindness, courage, and humanity." He gestured to Margaret, who sat quietly at the table, her hands folded in her lap. "This woman, Margaret Holloway, saved my father's life in a time of despair. Without her, this restaurant would not exist. It stands as a testament to her selflessness, and yet we failed to honor her tonight." His words resonated deeply, and the once aloof patrons now appeared humbled, their faces reflecting a mix of shame and reflection. Alan's gaze swept across the room, resting momentarily on Julia and Daniel, who stood near the back, their heads bowed. "We cannot call ourselves a place of distinction if we forget the values upon which we were built. From this day forward, let Margaret's story remind us to treat every guest with the respect and dignity they deserve." Julia, the young hostess, stepped forward hesitantly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She approached Margaret with small, deliberate steps, her polished heels clicking against the marble floor. "Miss Holloway," she began, her voice trembling, "I am deeply sorry for how I treated you earlier. I allowed my assumptions to cloud my judgment, and for that, I sincerely apologize." Margaret looked up, her kind eyes meeting Julia's. "Thank you, dear," she said softly, her voice devoid of resentment. "It takes courage to admit a mistake." The sincerity in her tone disarmed Julia, who nodded gratefully before stepping back. Daniel, the manager, followed suit, his usual polished demeanor replaced with visible remorse. "Ms. Holloway," he said, his voice steady but subdued, "I take full responsibility for what happened tonight. My behavior was inexcusable, and I hope you can forgive me." Margaret nodded, offering a faint smile. "Forgiveness is easy," she replied. "Understanding is what matters." Her words, simple yet profound, left Daniel momentarily speechless. As the apologies concluded, the staff brought out a second course, each dish carefully crafted to reflect the restaurant's renowned culinary excellence. Margaret watched as plates of vibrant colors and intricate designs were set before her. She hadn't tasted such food in decades, and each bite brought a mix of delight and nostalgia. Alan remained at the table, listening as Margaret recounted stories of his father during the war. He was a determined man, she said, her voice tinged with warmth. Even in pain, he found ways to lift the spirits of those around him. I knew he would survive. He had a fire in him that couldn't be extinguished. Alan smiled, recognizing the traits she described. He carried that fire into everything he did, he said. Including this restaurant. The room, though bustling with activity, seemed quieter as patrons leaned in, listening to snippets of their conversation. Margaret's presence had transformed the evening, her quiet dignity leaving an indelible mark on everyone in attendance. At a nearby table, a young couple who had initially scoffed at Margaret's arrival now whispered among themselves. I can't believe we judged her, the woman admitted, her voice tinged with regret. She's extraordinary. Her companion nodded, his gaze fixed on Margaret. It's a lesson, isn't it? He replied. You never know someone's story until you take the time to listen. Similar sentiments echoed throughout the room. Patrons who had once dismissed Margaret now reflected on their own behavior. The shift in atmosphere was palpable, a collective realization of the biases they carried. Alan, observing the change, felt a deep sense of pride. His father's vision had been rekindled, and Margaret was at the heart of it. Later in the evening, Julia approached Alan with a nervous energy. Sir, she began, her voice soft, I'd like to make things right. May I help organize an event to honor Ms. Holloway's story? Something that reflects the values your father held dear? Alan studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes searching hers for sincerity. He saw no trace of insincerity, only a young woman eager to redeem herself. That's a wonderful idea, he said finally. Let's make it happen. Julia's face lit up with gratitude, and she nodded earnestly. Margaret, who had overheard the exchange, smiled gently. You don't need to honor me with events, she said. Just remember to treat others with kindness. That's all the recognition I need. Her humility struck Julia deeply, and she resolved to ensure the restaurant would never again falter in its mission. As the evening wound down, Alan presented Margaret with a framed copy of the letter she had carried for so many years. The original would be preserved in the restaurant's archives, but this copy would serve as a reminder of the bond between Margaret and his father. Margaret held the frame delicately, her eyes welling with tears. This means more to me than you'll ever know, she said. Alan placed a reassuring hand on hers. It's we who owe you everything, he replied. The other patrons, now gathered near the table, offered their own words of gratitude. Some spoke of how Margaret's story had inspired them to reconsider their own actions, while others simply thanked her for reminding them of the importance of compassion. Margaret, overwhelmed but grateful, accepted their words with grace. As the evening progressed, the patrons, moved by Margaret's story, began whispering among themselves. One by one, they approached Alan discreetly, offering to contribute to Margaret in some meaningful way. She deserves more than just apologies, said a well-dressed older man. Is there anything we can do to support her? Alan listened, touched by the genuine sentiments. He approached Margaret and gently broached the subject. Several people here would like to offer their help, whether it's financial support or something else. Would you allow that? Margaret shook her head with a soft smile. I didn't come here for charity, Alan, she said, her voice firm but kind. Tonight has given me more than enough. Alan nodded, respecting her decision, but he couldn't help but feel inspired by her humility. Then we'll honor you in other ways, he said quietly, and Margaret nodded, her gaze warm. Around them, the patrons watched in awe, many reflecting on how such grace could exist in someone who had endured so much. As the evening wound down, Margaret folded her hands in her lap, gazing at the empty plate before her. The meal had been exquisite, but it was the kindness she'd experienced tonight that truly nourished her spirit. Alan walked her to the entrance, his demeanor as attentive as if she were royalty. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, looking up at him. "Your father would be proud of the man you've become." Her words caught Alan off guard, and he felt a lump form in his throat. "It's I who should thank you," he said, "for reminding us of what truly matters." As she stepped outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the city lights. Alan watched as Margaret walked away, her back straight and her step steady. She looked almost regal in her quiet dignity, a stark contrast to the initial treatment she had received. The next morning, Alan gathered the staff for an emergency meeting. The events of the previous night had left him with a renewed sense of purpose. "Last night, we failed someone who represents everything this restaurant stands for," he began. "That will never happen again." He outlined changes to ensure the restaurant lived up to its original mission. These included customer service training focused on empathy, a program to host charity dinners, and a renewed emphasis on creating an inclusive atmosphere. The staff listened intently, many nodding in agreement. Julia, in particular, felt a surge of determination. As word of the evening spread, the restaurant began to attract a new wave of patrons. People came not just for the food but for the values the establishment now championed. Reviews praised the warm, welcoming atmosphere, and the restaurant's reputation was reborn, this time rooted in its commitment to kindness and inclusion. Julia threw herself into her work with a newfound passion. She organized the first of many charity dinners, dedicating the event to Margaret and her story. The staff worked tirelessly to prepare, ensuring every detail reflected the values Alan's father had cherished. On the night of the event, the restaurant buzzed with energy. The attendees included a mix of regular patrons, community members, and those in need of a warm meal. Julia personally welcomed each guest, her demeanor kind and approachable. Alan watched her with quiet pride, grateful for her transformation. Margaret, who had been invited as the guest of honor, sat at the head table, her presence lending the evening an air of grace. She spent the night speaking with attendees, her humility and warmth leaving a lasting impression. Julia, reflecting on the journey that had brought them all to this point, felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Among the attendees that night was the same young couple who had mocked Margaret on her first visit. They approached her hesitantly, their faces a mixture of guilt and respect. "Miss Holloway," the woman began, her voice faltering, "we want to apologize for how we treated you that night. We judged you unfairly, and we're truly sorry." Margaret smiled gently, her eyes kind. "Thank you," she said. "It takes courage to admit a mistake. I hope this evening reminds all of us to treat others with kindness." The couple nodded, visibly moved. They left the event with a newfound resolve to embody the values they had witnessed in Margaret. As the night drew to a close, Margaret once again found herself walking home through the city streets. This time, the rain had given way to a crisp, clear sky. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if reflecting the hope she now felt. She clutched the framed letter Alan had given her, its weight a comforting reminder of the bonds she had rekindled. Her mind wandered back to the young soldier she had saved, his smile vivid in her memory. "I kept my promise," she whispered softly to herself, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and relief. Her steps quickened as she neared her modest home. Though her life would continue as it always had, Margaret felt a profound sense of contentment. She had been seen, heard, and honored in a way she never thought possible. News of the night's events spread quickly, not just among the city's elite but throughout the community. Articles and blogs praised the restaurant for its transformation, and Margaret's story became a beacon of hope for many. People from all walks of life began visiting the restaurant, drawn by its message of compassion and inclusivity. Alan, recognizing the power of Margaret's story, ensured her legacy became a cornerstone of the restaurant's identity. The ripple effect extended beyond the restaurant. Inspired by the events, local businesses began adopting similar initiatives, creating a network of establishments dedicated to kindness and service. Margaret's quiet strength had ignited a movement she never intended but deeply embodied. In the weeks following the charity dinner, Alan found himself reflecting deeply on his role as the restaurant's leader. He had always focused on upholding its reputation as an elite establishment, yet Margaret's story had reminded him that his father's vision extended far beyond exclusivity. It was about community, kindness, and creating a space where everyone felt valued. He began spending more time with the staff, ensuring they understood the restaurant's renewed mission. During meetings, he shared stories about his father's humility and the sacrifices he had made to build the restaurant. "This place is not about the chandeliers or the gourmet dishes," Alan told them one morning. "It's about the people who walk through those doors." Alan's transformation wasn't limited to his professional life. Inspired by Margaret, he started volunteering at local shelters and connecting with community leaders to support initiatives for those in need. The more he gave of himself, the more fulfilled he felt. His work became a reflection of his father's legacy, and in honoring that, Alan finally felt he was living up to the Grayson name. Julia, too, underwent a profound change. Once focused solely on maintaining appearances and climbing the professional ladder, she now prioritized creating meaningful connections with guests and coworkers alike. Her charity dinner had been a success, but she didn't stop there. She proposed new ideas to Alan, including hosting a monthly dinner for underprivileged families and setting up a mentorship program for aspiring chefs from low-income backgrounds. Alan, impressed by her initiative, appointed her as the head of community outreach for the restaurant. Julia embraced her new role with enthusiasm, often reflecting on the moment that had changed her perspective. She kept a photo of Margaret at her desk as a reminder of the lessons she had learned. If Margaret could carry herself with such grace despite everything she faced, Julia often thought, then so can I. Months later, Margaret returned to the restaurant at Alan's invitation. This time, the atmosphere was entirely different. The staff greeted her warmly, their smiles genuine, and the patrons treated her with the respect she deserved. Alan led her to a new centerpiece in the restaurant, a plaque mounted on the wall, inscribed with the words of the letter Margaret had carried for so many years. Below the inscription was a simple dedication, in honor of Margaret Holloway, whose kindness and courage inspired a legacy of compassion. Margaret stood before the plaque, her eyes filling with tears. She reached out to touch it, her fingers tracing the letters gently. "This is too much," she whispered, her voice trembling. Alan, standing beside her, shook his head. "It's not enough," he said softly. "You are the heart of this place, Margaret. This is your legacy as much as my father's." As Margaret dined that evening, she marveled at how much the restaurant had changed. The atmosphere was vibrant, not just with luxury but with warmth and inclusivity. Families from all walks of life filled the tables, their laughter and conversation blending harmoniously. Alan stopped by her table toward the end of the night, sitting across from her. "You've changed so much, Alan," Margaret said, her voice filled with admiration. "Your father would be proud." Alan smiled, his gaze steady. "I have you to thank for that," he replied. "You reminded me of what truly matters." As Margaret left the restaurant, she paused at the entrance, looking back at the plaque one last time. A sense of peace washed over her, knowing that her small act of kindness all those years ago had created ripples far beyond what she could have imagined. The restaurant flourished in the years to come, not just as a place of fine dining but as a symbol of hope and humanity. Alan, Julia, and the staff carried Margaret's story forward, ensuring that every guest was treated with dignity and respect. And Margaret, in her quiet home, lived out her days knowing she had left the world a little better than she found it.